What do I mean when I'm talking about poverty in the world? The World Bank defines extreme poverty in terms of not having enough to meet your basic needs. For many years, it said that people living on less than $1 per day were extremely poor. And you might have heard the figure that there are about 1 billion people in the world who live on less than $1 per day. Just recently, the World Bank upped that to $1.25 US, still less than 2 Australian dollars. So what does it mean to try and survive on less than that? For a start, it means that you can't really be sure that you will be able to put enough food on the table for yourself or your family. But in addition to that, you may not have safe drinking water available. So you may have to walk for 2 hours a day to fetch water. It's a life really where you can perhaps just struggle to cover your basic physical needs, but you don't have the opportunity to lead a life that has the sort of dignity that we think of as a minimally decent life for human beings.
What do you mean by basic needs? I'd like you to define it, because your definition might be different to mine.
Well, the real concept of basic needs, if you cut it right down, are simply the physical needs that are unavoidable for all of us. So to have enough calories to keep our bodies going, to have shelter from extreme elements, to have water that is safe to drink. So I think that's the core of it. Now, I would go a little beyond that. I would say to have some minimal level of health care should also be considered a basic need. Also, I would add some level of education for your children. I think at least a primary school level of education should be considered a basic need. UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Foundation, tells us that almost 10 million children die every year from preventable poverty-related causes. That's 27,000 children dying every day. We know how to reduce the number of deaths of children in developing countries, but we don't put enough resources into it to really do the job, to do it fast and effectively. And it's quite possible that for the cost of an expensive pair of shoes, we could save a child's life if we give it to one of those organizations that's working effectively against poverty. Ask yourself, have you bought something to drink in the last week when you had safe water coming out of the tap for free? Perhaps you bought bottled water, perhaps you bought a juice, perhaps you bought a beer or a latte, whatever it might be. If you didn't spend on that and you put that money aside, at the end of the year, you might well have enough to give to one of those organizations that are helping people in poverty and perhaps to save a child's life. Perhaps you upgraded your television to a flat screen TV, or perhaps you went on a holiday abroad, or you bought some new clothes because the clothes that you wear, though they weren't worn out, were not the current fashions and you were tired of them. Again, that shows that you have more than you need, that you are affluent. And the question that I'm asking is, if we have that ability to help those in poverty, shouldn't we be doing it?
I like to think that most Australians are charitable people. We've always been ready to give generously in times of crisis. But we're also people who work hard. Haven't we earned the right to enjoy life? Maybe that does mean sometimes splurging on an overseas holiday, or a new dress, or a better TV. In setting up this new standard of giving, which is what you're talking about, do you want people to totally rethink luxury?
I want people to rethink the role that luxury plays in their lives as compared with other goals that I want them to adopt. So I want them to say, one of my important goals must be to share some of my comfort, some of my good fortune with those who are really poor. If I do that, and I still feel that it's important for me to have some luxuries, some indulgences, I'm not going to condemn that. I think that once you've played your part, then, okay, we have grown used to a level of comfort that is hard to give up. But I would like people to rethink what is involved in living a good life, and to rethink at least the minimum standard that they have to measure up to in order to feel okay about then spending something on luxuries.
Do you ever feel that you're playing on people's guilt for being prosperous?
I try to appeal to people's compassion and sympathy for others rather than their guilt. I don't think guilt is really terribly productive. I mean, it may be for some people a good thing that gets them moving. But I don't want people to be, lying awake, tortured with guilt at night. I want them to actually write that check or go online and use that credit card, and then I want them to feel good about it. That's much better, I think. I want them to feel good about it. I want them to talk to others about how they feel good about it and how their lives go better because of that. Because that's a more effective way to make it spread than to just try to get guilt to spread. That's not going to do any good.
But can you direct me back to a time in history when we didn't have any extreme mass poverty?
No, I think probably we are for the first time in a situation where we have the resources to create a world without extreme mass poverty. After all, for most of our history, people had to struggle simply to find enough food and shelter to survive. But we've now got to the point where the average person in an affluent country earns enough in just a few hours, not even a full working day, to feed themselves for a week, if we're simply focusing on purchasing food. So that gives us much more spare capacity, and that's what I think makes it wrong not to focus on this. The fact that for the first time we have the opportunity to change the world and put this behind us.
Isn't it true that it's trade and globalisation that has really reduced the numbers of people in poverty?
I think it's true that trade has played a huge role in pulling hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty. We see that particularly in China and in India. But there are some things that trade doesn't do. Trade doesn't seem to be very good at really reaching the people on the very bottom, that poorest 10% of the world's population. Trade hasn't really been so effective in some parts of Africa where the proportion of people living in extreme poverty is highest, but there really isn't the infrastructure for them to produce something and then transport it to a port where they can sell it to us.
According to Peter Singer, if the globalisation of trade hasn't reached the extreme poor, the globalisation of climate change certainly has.
I think climate change is a classic example of how the world has become one, how we're all interwoven, and how things that we might think are quite private and local, such as how much do we drive, what sort of car do we drive, even, what do we eat, because beef produces a lot of greenhouse gases. But those things that we think of as private and personal decisions are actually having an impact on people on the other side of the world. And so we can't deny now that we're all interconnected. We can't shirk responsibility for changing the lives of people we never see.
What do you say to people who would reply to you, this is a government's job, it's not for me?
If the government were doing that job adequately and effectively, I would be very happy. But In Australia, the government is giving only 32 cents in every $100 that the nation earns to overseas aid, and even that is not really going to the world's poorest people. So I would say, do you think that's enough? What I see at the moment is that the non-government agencies are the ones who are really doing the most effective work, the ones who are efficiently getting out there, directly helping the people who in need, working through local grassroots organisations, and we all have it within our capacity to help them to do a lot more.